Awesome. Thanks for having me over.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's maybe start with the beginning. I actually don't really know, other than your blog post about it, or talking to Chris or something a long time ago, kind of how it started. So can you just kind of give me the quick sort of what's the origin story?
Origin story is it's probably like young adult, 20 years old or something at that point. Building lots of random things. It's mostly just like that desire to like build open source and stuff. And I think open source is already, it was a thing. GitHub wasn't quite there. I remember I had to migrate it to GitHub at some point, the project, but it was just like one of many random things I just kind of put out there as an example. And it turned out to be useful and interesting. And I did a lot of things in like the Django community back in the day. And so that kind of led to the same where I maintained it over the years because you have like this desire to work on things that people are interested in. And then turned out to become very, very useful, and eventually spun up a business around it. And this is back in, we just started the project in 2008, I believe that's correct. It gets harder and harder to remember these dates. 15 years ago. And then we started the business, I think, in 2012. And so it had a few years to bake. And I like to always say to people, for better or worse, we had product market fit by the time we started the business, which is, a great problem to have. But yeah, it was just a thing that we kept working on, and
so
found a way.
The server part of it was open source before, like you had
the whole thing.
The client.
The whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And so the whole thing was open source.
And you were running it inside a company that you're working at, or you were doing it just completely?
So completely open source, and then eventually I joined a company that was actually using it. I don't know if I had used it before that. It was like a weird stage of life where I wasn't working for like real companies, so.
I mean, it's an interesting question though, because a lot of kind of what I'm trying to get out of people is kind of not how you found product market fit, but how you found people who love your product, right? And found it very useful. Because I feel like, like you said, like the business can kind of come after that, but you can also build a business that you never find anybody who likes your product, right? Like, so actually, just to backtrack a little bit, how did you get into open source in the first place? Like you're in the Django community, it sounds like it was a Django
Django was kind of, I think it was like, I'd say my gateway, but I mean, I'm 38 now, and so I kind of grew up on the internet where we had hot scripts and these weird websites where you download Perl scripts, and that was like your source for free code, right? And I think open source was less interesting that it was like the philosophy of open source, more interesting that it was free. And I think that's probably common.
You could learn from it.
Yeah, you could learn from it, you could use it, do whatever, very few strings attached. And so it just seemed like a natural way to write a lot of code that probably was not that important anyways, in all honesty. And so just kept going from there. And I think that was big. And I think a lot of my community upbringing was in the Python Django community. And so much smaller than the world is, now. But I would go to these conferences all the time. Very small network of people. We were hanging out on IRC, past generation Discord. And again, it was just like hallway track of conferences, but it was a little bit digital, still conferences. Met a lot of people, met a lot of the GitHub folks in those days. And I think it was just like a natural thing because you were always seeking something, and for me, it was like I was seeking sort of validation of ideas or something, which is kind of like how you think about product,
Well, so if you weren't using it professionally, how did you go about sort of improving the product or building the product up? Like, I feel like a lot of times that kind of comes from it being in the trenches a little bit. Like how do you grow an open source project that, like, you're getting a lot of feedback from other people that are using it at larger scale, or you have some side projects that's using it or something, like how
so there was, I don't actually remember that era that well, but I joined a company called Discuss way back when, and this is when I met, we're like right below GitHub in that tiny office. And dubstep thumping at 5 o'clock. I remember.
Sorry about that.
They were using Sentry and a bunch of other Django libraries that I had written, right? And that's also how I had met my co-founder before that, Chris. I don't remember exactly how, but he was working at Discuss and kind of brought me in. And so they were using it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, there was a reason to make it way better. Because at the time it was completely jank. Like I took down Discuss the first week I was there, and it was worse because they were using the Sentry thing. It was called Django DB log back in the day, because it couldn't scale whatsoever. And so we fixed it right then and there because we had a real reason. But I always made this like conscious effort to like work on work problems during the day, and I would just mess around with stuff in the evenings. I would like building stuff was always my hobby. The Instapot.
Coffee's ready?
That'd be brutal this time.
So how'd you meet your co-founder? Or actually, more importantly, like it sounds like you met them at Discuss, but like, when did you decide to kind of roll it out and go down the path of saying, I can make a business out of this?
Chris and I had both been at Discuss for like 3 years or something. I don't remember why. I think frustrations. We both had our own reasons for leaving, but we didn't leave to work on Sentry. Even though we had actually already bootstrapped Sentry, the company, it wasn't making that much money, and we didn't know it was going to be anything. So he joined GitHub, and I went and worked at Dropbox for a little while, and then about a year and a half, 2 years went by, and by that point, it's like, okay, we have real customers. It's real infrastructure we're running. I don't know how GitHub was, but like Dropbox was a massive pain for me. It was becoming a big company very fast, and I'm not a big fan of company politics. And we could match our salaries. And that was a big deal at that point because we're like, oh, we built something. We got a great lifestyle business. Very different than what we are today. But it was kind of like the risk had gone away, and we had all these frustrations that we can kind of take care of, and we can become truly independent. And it was just, at that point, it was almost like a no-brainer. It's like, well, we have this thing that's really interesting. It's making more and more money every month. It's almost growing itself, but it requires a lot of care. You know, we're still building a product. We're still doing customer support, all this other stuff. And then we have full-time jobs where we work for somebody else. And so I think that worked out pretty well. Kind of the timing of it all, I guess.
And how long was it? It took a while to raise VC, or you tried to get some outside money right after that?
I mean, so we bootstrapped the company in 2012. We raised VC at the started the fundraise at like March 2015. But we left our jobs January, or actually Chris left a little bit before me, but I started full-time at Sentry January 2015. So it's pretty quick going from, okay, we've got a great thing, what next? We should go raise money. And I will tell you, we had no idea why or what we were doing raising money. It was awful. But it was one of those things like, oh, there's an opportunity, we should grow it. That was all that was in the head. Like, it's like, okay, grow it as big as it can be. And I'll tell you, my imagination did not lead me to believe it would be like it is today. In any means, because we actually, one thing you do when you raise venture usually, or something like it pretty quickly early on, is map out how you're going to get to like, 100 million in revenue or something like that, because it's got to be a feasible business, right? And I remember doing this whiteboard session early on. I'm like, no chance. This makes no sense. Whatever, we'll entertain this. I'm going to go with it. We raised a seed. It's it. We'll see what happens. We'll play it by ear, basically. And that's kind of been our motto, like the whole time: play by ear, raise ambitions. When we hit a goal, keep going from there. So.
Yeah, part of the conference thing is about community, and I'm curious, like one of the things that I was just talking to Tom earlier about, trying to remember how we built GitHub, like which is very big, and like Sentry's, what do you guys have? There's like 4 million or something users at this point, or
users. I don't know. It's such a confusing number.
I mean, it's a ton, right? Whatever it is, it's a ton, and it's a lot of different. It's a lot of different sub communities that are kind of within that. And it sounds like you started in Python, you started in Django specifically.
Yep. Yeah.
And kind of. Did you build up a following there and make sure that they really liked that, and like pretty much everybody using Django was using this if they were doing something, and then expand into community after community in a targeted fashion, or was it kind of more, it just grew how it grew and you rolled with the punches?
Yeah, I think it was a little both. So we were very successful in Django, and it's like any big Django, because Django was like up and coming at the time. It's like the Rails of the era, and it's like you had like Instagram and Eventbrite and Yelp and Discuss, which seemed like a big fish to me at the time. But you had all these companies that were like up and comers in that community, the biggest websites on the planet running that thing. All of them used Sentry, and that was great. And I'd go to conferences, and I knew all the other core developers, or like I knew the core community people building other third-party stuff in the ecosystem, and we'd always just hack on stuff together, And so that worked out really well. And I had, like, if you ignore what DevRel is these days, because I'm not really sure. But like I was actually doing DevRel, but I was just an engineer. I was going to the conference. I was speaking about interesting stuff. I was networking with people. I was working on stuff with them. I was validating the ideas from like a product PM standpoint. And I just kept doing that over the years, and I built reputation, right? And so I think that's what secured us in this Python Django space. And fortunately, Python was very important as well. We hadn't converted to this Node TypeScript era. Rails was still big, but it had kind of, I think Django shortly around the same time, they all kind of plateaued before like the TypeScript wave. But what we saw was like some people wanted it because the technology wasn't like the idea, the product, it's a dashboard of errors. Like it wasn't a common thing everybody had. Like there was a one in Ruby on Rails that existed at the time, and that was it. And I don't remember we didn't make a lot of intentional decisions during that. It's like open source repo, we want users. If people had feedback and we agree with it, we're gonna do something about it. We'll fix the bugs, we'll do all these things.
So did you decide, to put engineering resources into an agent of a different language if you see it coming up, or did it tend to be somebody in the community kind of made one and you embraced it? Or
early on it was all like community open source, right? People built little SDKs and stuff. That did not get that far. That amount of effort does basically nothing for you. It's not, field of dreams, build it, they will come quite, You got to put a lot of energy. And I think that's the thing people miss. So we intentionally went after market segments, especially when we raised money. So one of our first hires was, half the early team I just worked with to discuss, so I just hired people I knew. But one was a big JavaScript guy, Ben Vinegar. And I'm like, okay, we've got myself, Armin Roniker, who's a big Python guy. We need somebody we wanted Ben anyways, but it's also like, oh, it's great. Like Ben's spoken at JavaScript conferences. He's got that same, following, but in JavaScript a little bit. And then we also recognized around this time, like, oh, JavaScript's like this gateway for all the companies. And we're like trying to build a business too. And it's like, well, they all use jQuery and they all have these widgets on their website. So we'll just build JavaScript and all the companies will be our customers. That was our kind of point of view. That was the first big thing we went after. And then coincidentally, React got really, really, really big. And we just crushed it from that. Like 60%, I think, of our customer base runs our JavaScript SDKs. Maybe in addition to other stuff, but they also use JavaScript. And so it's huge. We did that. We saw PHP was lacking. We saw the Laravel community was like interesting. It was kind of like Django Rails, So we went after that. We showed up at the conference. We helped them throw a party. We built the best product experience we could at that time.
Speaking of that, like what have you guys found is a good way of talking to developers? Like you're saying, going to conferences, buying beer, whatever, like kind of just like talking to people in real life, right? I mean, you must do, like, obviously you get a lot of feedback through customer service and things like that too. Like how are you figuring out what people love or what people need in your product? Like, do you find that the conference thing, I've heard both ways. I've heard people be like, don't go to conferences. I find it really valuable to go and sponsor the after party, whatever, and just talk to people about what they need. But I'm curious kind of how you found value in or as a company, I suppose, or even individually, how you found value in, like, do you go and talk to people personally? Do you set up, discuss or Discord? Discuss. You just put discuss in my head,
Okay, I think there's an interesting anecdote here. GitHub, early days, when I moved to San Francisco, when we're in those small offices, GitHub, like, once a month had this, like, happy hour thing, like GitHub Pub Nights or whatever it was called. I met so many amazing people there, and I loved going to them so much. One, I'm a young kid, new city, got nothing better to do. Two, I'm meeting, like, literally, like, the people that built a lot of the core technology we rely on today. Yeah. And it was just, like, so, like, just the work conversation was always really exciting. And so I think you've got to, like, appreciate that, and you just try to apply that same kind of model. And I'm not saying we have not figured this out, let me tell you, but I think there are two things. There's one's how do you sort of do sales and marketing, and then two, how do you build a product? And I actually don't know if they're coupled or not. We kind of are mediocre at the sales and marketing, but marketing is something else. So we do a lot of, like, brand marketing, which I think is probably fairly similar to GitHub. And I would actually argue GitHub's probably the only company more successful than us from a sheer numbers and breadth of developer audience. If you, at least from, like, a sort of service-oriented thing, there's obviously things like IDs and whatnot that are huge, and programming languages and all these other things. But it's very rare that, like, a company manages to penetrate a really large developer market. And I don't think you can do it through cool ads or cold emails and stuff like that.
I'm curious why you think, if you have, like, an idea of why you think that might be, like, obviously there's a part of it, which is we built on technologies. I mean, GitHub is a lot more generic. Like, you can put dot files on GitHub, right? Like, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to have an agent. Like, at least you guys have to have kind of an agent per language. But there's not that many active programming languages that people professionally develop in, right? So, or have like, need exception monitoring, for example, right? But, like, once that's done, it is fairly broad. It's a fairly broad problem set that kind of everybody has, right? Do you think that it's kind of part of the broadness of what we're trying to tackle that makes it, like, that other if it's Next.js or whatever, it's very specific, or but, like, have you found it difficult to get to that type of scale, like, not just be constrained into one specific niche or something, right?
I think it's tough. I think the world is very big these days, and tech is very big, and so there's a lot of, like, I think the problems of small enterprise B2B are long gone. Like, even, like, a successful enterprise company has thousands of customers now. So it's not, you can do the hand-to-hand combat thing, but, like, whatever. But I think the thing that people don't appreciate is that if you look at the best businesses in the world, like tech isn't any different than anything else. And my favorite thing to associate with people, liquid death. It's like canned water, has a cool can. They don't sell water. It's still water in a can. It's not a new idea. It's not even sparkling. They sell not beer. It's like, that's what they're selling. To me, GitHub isn't selling source control. It's selling like this community thing. I put my dot files on there because I just want to share them with people, right? And I think people lose that sometimes when they think about product and then the marketing angle. And I think that's where it can couple a lot. So like I tell people at work, I'm like, do not try to convince people error monitoring is cool. It's not cool. Like nobody cares at all. It's like make them like what we stand for, our ethos, And so that's why we focus on like our open source principles, or like we have this pro privacy stuff we're working on, or like just the engineering quality of our work or something. Or maybe it's like visual brand is a good example, right? Like everybody loves Linear for visual brand, right? I don't even know if the product's probably great. No idea if the product's great though, but I still assume Linear is great,
Actually, from a marketing, I want to get back to the open source thing too.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to talk about that. But like from a marketing standpoint, it's interesting because I feel like GitHub really took advantage. Like we didn't do a lot of specific marketing because the product kind of had this virality built into it, in that people would go to conferences and they wanted to share. It had this YouTube quality, right? Like I put my dot files and I'll tell you to go to GitHub to get my dot files, right? Or to get my program, or to get my library that I'm talking about, a thing. And we really, we could take advantage of not having to do very much marketing from a getting the word out thing. But I feel like you don't have that, right? Like nobody goes and shares their exception or something like that. Like how even from the early days, like you can't go and shake everybody's hands at conferences to get to millions of users. Like how does Sentry spread?
So that's what's interesting. Go back to the conferences. You can have a booth at every conference in the world, and it'll do a little bit, sure. You might as well buy ads, it's the same thing. Yeah. And so you go to conferences and I think, okay, this might be a little bit more, again, I don't think it's developer tools, but I think it matters in the same way it matters for like a Porsche or something like that. Because all these brands kind of overlap. You're building trust. Like, I trusted a lot of components of GitHub, and that's why I used it to share my code, and I trust people building GitHub and all these things, right? Like, I think people trust Sentry. And the way you do that is not necessarily like, the product works or something. It could be any number of things. And so, like, I think a good example of trust is like, you are coming and teaching us something that's completely unrelated. And so when I would go to conferences, I would speak about how to scale Python applications, or some interesting stuff about how Sentry's open source and we were building a business and we bootstrapped and all this stuff. It's just like genuinely interesting and useful content. Like it was value add, right? Yeah. And I think people get lost in this idea of like, I hate when we go to conferences and somebody's just doing like a demo of Sentry. I'm like, who cares? I'm like, yeah, there's gonna be some guy from Wells Fargo and that's fine. And he might think the demo's cool. He's still not gonna buy the product. Instead, you just need to make them, it's like a club. Like a dance club, right? And it's like lines around the block. Everybody wants to go to where the line is. They all want to be part of like the same party, And there's some version of that. And I always just think of like, I saw this like famous guy. His name's Omar Johnson. He was a former CMO of Beats by Dre, the headphones. Mm-hmm. And I'm super inspired by brand marketing, if it's not clear. But I remember he was like the number 2 guy at Nike before that. And I think Beats headphones are trash for what it's worth. Somehow they did great. And I'm just like, I don't get it. And he's just like, you got to look at the companies and the way they approach things. Like they didn't compete against Bose. Like, technically our headphones are better. They probably weren't. They competed like as if they were like Porsche or somebody else that's selling a brand and selling this idea or what, like just something that people want to believe in or associate themselves with. And I think you can do the same thing in tech. Now, I think that is very specific to a stage of the company, to be fair. Like, can you do it early on? Maybe. Feels harder. Feels harder if it doesn't naturally kind of gravitate towards something like that. But when you see you have that opportunity, I think you can take advantage of it. I think early on, you just it is literally like sales, but not literally sales. Like you are talking to everybody as much as possible. Like, hey, you got to try this out. I want feedback. I need feedback. Please try this out. And it's a lot easier if you have a network of peers and things like that to get going. So
it's interesting. I was thinking about earlier. I think I was reading one of your blog posts, and you listed out some of the competition that you had when you came in, because it's not like you were the first exception tracking software in the world, right? Like this has been happening for a while, and you named a couple. I think Exceptional. I remember
Exceptional,
but
Hoptoad.
There were Hoptoad. Yeah, I've used as well. Years ago before that. But like now, it feels like you guys have really kind of dominated the market. Do you think was it you kind of you were in the right place with the JavaScript thing and rode that in a nice way, or do you think it was like, it feels like a lot of the other, some of these don't exist anymore, or some of them kind of, they still run, but there's not like a lot of effort behind them. Like how, I'm just curious if you have like an internal idea of like why you think that it differentiated so much.
I think it's hard to say one specific thing. I think the JavaScript thing, great decision by us. Everybody else tried to do the same thing. We were just better. We're better in every single way. We had the better network. We had the better employees. One company had pretty good brand design and visual design, but generally speaking, we had better brand. We had like literally a better product in a lot of different ways. We did stuff that was uncomfortable for other people to do from like a technical challenge point of view. And so I think it's like, and I go back to like ethos, it's like our whole thing was like, we're gonna be the best at all these things. And even when we raised money, we're like, we can't let the other companies have more money than us, like to be able to, or like, and we raised money because we couldn't hire that many people that fast. We're like, we're gonna raise money, we gotta hire more people than this other company. Because like we can't let them win. This is like our opportunity to kind of succeed, And so I think some of these decisions were really good. We probably could have been more strategic about it because, as an example, that Laravel thing, I saw the other company doing it and dominating. I'm like, we can't allow it. And that is our entire model. The company's like ultra competitive, be the best, be everywhere. But then you very quickly come to realize like some places don't matter. And that was like an interesting learning too, because like, we did Python and then, JavaScript and PHP and Ruby and kind of the standard emerging technology, if you will. Whether you think that is truth anymore or not, it's unclear. But and then we're like, okay, let's go get Java and .NET, all these random languages. And it turns out none of those people care. Like they still use our product and we make money off of it. But we literally look at those as just like a cost of doing business. They're just more like maintenance mode. Kind of sounds like a dirty word, but they're kind of like maintenance mode, whereas like the bread and butter of everything of people looking to adopt software is these other languages, and then sometimes mobile, but that's like a complicated thing, and we recognize that.
Do you find that because they are trying new things more, right? And so like they're kind of more the...
Yeah, I think that's what it is. They're just latching on to whatever the new tech is, and when you're building a new project, sometimes, big companies will just use their existing stack, but like think about mobile. Oh, we have to build a mobile app. Mobile's a nightmare all the time. It's like, what's the current generation of mobile? And you might go through agencies and stuff like that. And so we've even seen that from an enterprise point of view, like that's the gateway for it. But then JavaScript is like literally, and so we acquired this company called CodeCov, right? It does test coverage reporting. Yeah. The biggest challenge we have is like, how do we turn that company into a market share business, right? And it's like the only way you can succeed in a developer tool that's kind of like ours, that like where you're sort of, the needs are sort of coupled to a technology, the test runners, like how testing works and everything, that's theirs. Well, JavaScript people don't write tests. Like none of the browser folks do. It's like, it's completely untested for the most part, right? They're relying on like TypeScript and all this other stuff, I'm not saying that works, it doesn't, but it's like, well, they don't write tests. How do we get the JavaScript community? And that question's important because if we can't do that, it can't succeed. If we can't build something that can't go after that community in our kind of space, it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant, And that's an interesting thing I think a lot of people should think about, because it's not every developer tool, of course, right? Like, maybe you could do technology-specific stuff, like Dependabot and stuff, sure, but the core doesn't matter,
Actually, I think we did the opposite. We tried very hard not to do anything language-specific, right? And because there were a lot of times when that came, I think we had a gem server at some point, and we were like, we ripped it out, even though some people were using it, and we're like, we just can't be this specific about this, right?
Yeah.
But I wanted to go back to, actually, you talked about CodeCov. And I think this came up from a licensing issue as well, because you were like, okay, we're going to open source CodeCov, or was it open source before you acquired it, or not?
No, it was completely closed source.
Okay, and so you decided to open source it, but now this gets into sort of licensing issues, because I also wanted to talk about this from sort of a competition standpoint, because you guys are very famously open source and you have a lot of open source stuff. Was the competition not, or was the competition mostly open source as well?
So almost everybody was closed source. And I genuinely believe if you have all these attributes over here, like great product, all these things, you're doing really well there, and you're closed source, and somebody else has all those things and they're open source, you will lose, almost certainly. Yeah. And so I believe...
Developer tools,
Yeah, especially in developer tools. A lot of other stuff probably doesn't matter.
Do you think that's mostly because of just like ethos, or
I think it's a trust thing. People want, one, they want free software all the time.
Or like like trust from, I like how you operate, or trust from a security sort of audit standpoint, if I can see what you're doing. I think
it's a hypothetical on the latter, but they don't actually care. It's like, well, if you go out of business, I can self-host it or something like that. And there are a lot of people that want to self-host it, which is weird niche thing these days. It doesn't really matter. But I generally think it's like, we are developers. We like open source. We use open source. We prefer things be open source. It's just like how the world's, started to operate. And so, we were always that way. We were super permissive open source, and we're big believers in permissive open source. I'm not a big fan of copyleft and the GPL and things like that, and ignoring why it doesn't matter. But CodeCove was closed source. We're like, how do we make it open source-ish? And some years back, due to some really annoying company, which I think I wrote about in the blog, GitLab, it doesn't really matter to name them, but they wanted to basically effectively commercialize Sentry. They didn't contribute to Sentry or anything, and they didn't want to pay us any money. And so I'm like, well, we own it, so we're just going to relicense it, so you can't do that. And we did, and then we used a business source license. And it was fun because it felt like, okay, maybe this is a good balancing act where we only applied it to certain components, our core server code. We actually permissive open source a ton of very valuable stuff for the industry. Like all of our competitors use our open source, which is kind of a wild idea. But we did that, and we're like, well, it's time-based, so at least it becomes eventually open source, which means that idea of like it can survive forever is true. The code's always out there. It doesn't really matter if people reuse it or not.
And time-based, you're saying it converts into...
Yeah, it converts into like a true open source license. After, in our case, we were doing 3 years, and we chose Apache because we prefer permissive. And it was generally pretty easy to understand. It had one clause that's like you couldn't effectively, in layman's terms, you couldn't run a SaaS service selling Sentry, and we're like, this is great, It wasn't perfect, still isn't perfect, I would argue. And so we launched CodeCove, and then we're like, we kind of messed up a little bit there with some naming things. Marketing got a little too marketing in a sense of like they wrongly titled, I think, unclear if intentionally or not at this point, but the folks working on the post wrongly titled it CodeCove is now open source or something like that, and it wasn't. It's technically not. There might be parts that are open source, I'm not sure. But it's source available technically, right? Anyways, long story short, we used BSL for a bunch of these things, or BUSL, and we recently released our own FSL, which was originally FFSL, which is for fuck's sakes license. But the idea was just like, we want to be able to give people free software. And that's what most people care about in open source, whether the religious people think that or not. Like most people just want free software. They want to be able to use it, low limitations. And with the FSL, we basically locked in everything to make it more easy to understand. So it has to be permissive open source when it converts. It has to convert after 2 years. And it only protects you from SaaS commercialization. And so it's a fixed quantity thing for legal teams.
Have you found that there was any... So I feel like, I don't know if this is... I feel like I should have maybe researched this a little bit more, but I feel like there was some pushback to HashiCorp changing to BUSL with Terraform, and I saw a lot of pushback on that. Although it's hard to tell if it's more of a tempest in a teacup type, it's on Hacker News type bullshit and nobody really cares, or if people really got upset about it, right? There were forks of it and things like this. But you went from CodeCove from closed to this, and so but you have relicensed some other stuff, but only from BUSL to FSL, right?
Yeah. So we relicensed Sentry a long time ago. I saw a news article about this the other day. I want to say it's 2018, 2019, somewhere in there. And then we relicensed those same things that were already business source licensed to FSL, and we relicensed CodeCove to FSL. Okay. And so, but FSL is just a better version.
When
of it,
you did the first relicensing, did you get pushback in a way that
Not really. No? We did have somebody fork it, and then it turns out it's really hard to maintain somebody else's really large code base, and so they gave up very quickly, and they just wrote their own, and they try to use our SDKs. I mean, it's frustrating because it's similar to the people trying to commercialize it before. They had probably never even heard of Sentry before that day happened. They're like, oh, we're going to go fork this and monetize it. Fortunately, they failed. But yeah, there was Hacker News. That was it. You saw Hacker News getting all mad. Nobody else cared. Nobody cares, right? People appreciate that you can self-host. That's genuinely what they want. And again, we have an ethos around it. It's not just that you can self-host it. We want to make it open source, all these things, but there's a practical nature of things these days.
Do you guys have a hosted or a self-hosting? How do you say this? An on-premise version?
We don't commercial. So the SaaS, effectively all of the code is the same code that runs self-hosted or SaaS. There's a flag in there somewhere. Yeah. We don't open source, say, all of our these days ridiculous Kubernetes stuff, of course, and it's quite annoyingly complex to run Sentry, but the same code we're running in production is the same code that's out there.
But do you have like a sales team that
but we don't have anything there. We explicitly do not do anything for self-hosted or on-prem. We don't sell anything.
So it's on you if you want to do it.
It's on you, which seems fair.
Source.
It's like, and we try to provide support. We'll try to fix things, and we actually do have a team that's focused on the open source thing, which makes no money for us whatsoever.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of dev tools, companies have this, if they have some sort of service, have this problem, right? Because a lot of companies really want it to be, especially if there's any of their own. It depends on how much you get to proprietary, IP type stuff that goes onto that. But people really want to have self-hosted. It's like we got this from day one almost at GitHub.
Yeah.
And it was a complete nightmare. Like GitHub Enterprise was a nightmare constantly.
Yeah.
Like my whole time there, and I'm sure it still is. And it makes them a lot of money, right? Like it is a big part of that. But I think you guys kind of made this decision. This is not what we're going to focus on. We're just going to do SaaS stuff, which it must be frustrating. I mean, you must get pushback on this a lot internally, right? Of sales people or marketing people or something being like, we hear this people must ask for this all the time, right? And like, is that still like an internal struggle that you have, or is it just you've put the line in the sand and been like, we don't want to.
It's line in the sand. It's very simple. And I think this is the weakness of leadership in a lot of cases. And I think early on in a company, as soon as you find you got to have a belief, right? We believed SaaS was totally fine. Cloud services, totally fine. Plenty of evidence at the same time, right? Like our general belief is like outsource the data center, outsource the platform, just build your business logic. We're sort of part of the platform.
Yeah.
And so that was all right true. Early on, we did get a lot of pushback. Sales especially, nonstop. People wanted to pay us. We're like, no. And I swear to you, this went on for weeks and weeks on end of like, can we just sell on premises? And we even like bended a few times. We're like, okay, let's sell a support contract here, a support contract here. And they were just tedious and they were a distraction. And we didn't have the same problem as like, where like, I think you had 2 code bases or something, and it was merging was, something like that, But we're just like, we don't care. We don't need that business. We're going to build a cloud service. Turned out it's totally fine. And we just said, we're not talking about this anymore. It is effectively the company that we only build cloud services, and this is how the world operates. And if it breaks, we'll revisit that decision. But until the view of what we believe to be our path to success changes, that's what's going to be, law, And it worked really well. And I think you could argue, like, I think GitHub's done really well on SaaS, and even doing GitHub Enterprise, like GitLab almost exclusively makes money on the on-premise stuff. So I think there's still both, but in that it was different back then. That same period of time, you've seen like Atlassian and Splunk and all these big businesses move more towards like shared multi-tenant cloud services and stuff. And it's just a better model for everybody. You know?
Yeah, I mean, you guys also have that kind of release valve of saying, well, it is open source, so if you want to, you can do it. GitHub didn't really have that because we never open source. But we had this debate internally all the time of is this something that we want to open source? And we honestly came more down the if I remember correctly, of just being like, we don't want to support it, right? Like if we're going to put in like engineering time or support resources into supporting something, we might as well make some money off of it, because otherwise people are going to get mad at us that we don't help them, run their own thing. I don't know if you I've looked at how to, run your own GitLab instance, and it's a nightmare, right? Like it's very hard to do. There's just all of these. It's a very complex sort of system, and so we're like, you don't want it open source. Like it's going to be easier on everybody if it's not.
And I think that's the reality.
People still get mad, right?
People get mad, and it doesn't matter to them. It shouldn't matter to them that it's open source or closed source, because they're still just going to use the cloud service in almost all these cases. It's a little different. Like it's actually interesting because like GitHub's primarily IP, right? It's code, source code. We are this blend because we have source code, we have IP, and then we have complicated data that's sometimes user data, and so hypothetically, it's almost more sensitive for most companies for their data Sentry holds, because they'll get sued by the customers or something. Whereas like most people don't care about their IP that much, unless it's like a gaming company or something, And so I think it's a little bit different. But again, we were just like, we don't care. We are owning this model. If it fails, we'll do something else. And yeah, you're right. Yeah, we did have the ability to say you can just self-host, and that was important for what it's worth. When we went into fundraising, this is one of my favorite memories because I was so frustrated with these investors asking me just like silly trivia questions about how we're going to make money, all this stuff. And I'm like, look, if we can't make money, nobody's going to make money in this space, because we will ruin everybody else's business along the way. Like, we're going to have the best product. It's going to be the easiest thing to use. Like, everything's going to be great about it. And it's going to be free. And it was because it was totally open source, and it was way easier to run back in the day. And that worked. Those early competitors, we took away 10% of, maybe more, of one of those competitors' revenue overnight. We didn't get it from them, but it was a lot of the revenue from one customer, and then eventually that customer became a cloud customer. But they just set up Sentry, they started running it, and they're like, oh, it'd be better if we didn't have to run this, And so I think as a funnel, if you think about it as a business apparatus, it's a great funnel mechanism. And so, but I think the commercialization of on-premise is complicated, and I just think most companies, they're sort of in this like identity crisis of what are they actually trying to build? Who do they want for customers? And this is always what I talk to like founders about. I'm like, you got to have an opinion on what you want to build, like what you think is right. Do that until it doesn't work. And you got to have an opinion of like what kind of customer you want to work with. Like, because some businesses, let alone like, have to be, say, in the Global 2000 or something. And that gets to be like really tricky. And everything you do has to be different, Yeah. If we had done it on-premise, we'd have to have all these professional services teams and all this other investment that would have frankly taken away from building the product.
I just have a quick question. I have 1,000 more questions, but luckily you're coming to the conference and I get to ask all these questions, and we'll try to get some from the audience and stuff beforehand as well. But I'm curious about how you grow a team like this, right? So you have a little over 200 employees or so
now? We
now?
are 350, give or take.
350, okay. So I understand this to an interesting degree because I was also, started with 4 and I left GitHub when we were about 400 or so. Yeah. But it's very interesting, right? You guys, like, how, just, I don't know, a couple of, like, are you a remote company? It sounds like you have a couple of sort of hubs, right, around the world. Like, how do you build product? Like how does I'm mostly interested in your engineering team, like, because you're building a developer tool, and I'm we're going to be talking to a lot of developers, but like, is it fully remote? Do you have hubs? Like, how do you manage your work?
I'm a big believer in office culture for a lot of reasons. Like, even if you just simplify it, as an employer, you want to retain employees. You're more likely to retain employees when they have when they develop bonds with the rest of their team, right? Versus living in Tahoe and in the wilderness. And so I'm a big believer in that. There's a practical nature of the world too. And so we just say distributed. We're not remote. We're hub based, which is a weird word, but I think it is distributed. Like, we're 200 people in SF, 50 in Vienna, 40 in Toronto, a dozen in Seattle, maybe a dozen in Amsterdam, almost a dozen in New York now. And so we're like, that's good because you at least get the cohesion, but then we also have like a few people scattered around remote. And so I think it's complicated, and I don't know, especially when you get bigger, there's not much you can do about it. But I was always a believer in, like, all of my memories and all my friends are people I met at work, right? And that's such a valuable thing for people that are really driven in their careers. And as an employer, I'm like, how do I hire all those people, And so there's a lot of things in there, COVID, all these other things. But generally speaking, we're distributed. But I think the product and engineering actually is like really tricky because it's really hard to sustain early days culture in any functional way, and we've tried a lot of things. I have no correct opinion on what might actually work because we've tried a lot of stuff and it hasn't quite worked. One thing I do have a very strong conviction on though right now is if you are a developer tool, everybody needs to be some kind of developer at the company. Marketing needs to be engineering, sales needs to be engineering, maybe HR is fine, you can get away with that one. But like you can't fake it, Like, if you go to a conference, one of the ways we won early on, go to a conference. There's like 4 booths at this one conference. They've got 3 salespeople at their booth. We've got 3 engineers at our booth. Yeah. And I'm there, like the founder. Yeah. I'm like, you lost. You just instantly lost. There's no way you can compete with us. Like, you wasted all your money on this conference because you didn't send anybody that can like actually interact with anybody here, And they were not technical salespeople, to be clear. Like, I think you could get away with a type, but that's been like a big learning lesson because there is no more top down. Like, at least in our world, like in mainstream developer tools, you're not going to harass a CIO and they're going to mandate a tool because the team will rebel and they'll all go work at the next company, And that's something that people, like a lot of traditional companies, have still not come to grips with yet. And I think that is probably the biggest, maybe not lesson, because we've always kind of believed that, but the lesson of like, we actually need people to be much more technical everywhere, especially not just in engineering, but the whole of product, design and like traditional product management. They gotta get it. They gotta get the customer persona. Because like, what you don't want to do is spend your days arguing about like I'm the engineer. You're gonna tell me something that I disagree with when you've never written code or something. It's just a waste of everybody's time. And so I think, especially early days in a company, it's really important to get that engineering DNA in as many roles as you possibly can. So,
yeah, it's interesting. I'm at the point, so GitHub got fairly big and then sold, and now you see a lot of people leaving GitHub and kind of starting It's like the GitHub mafia, leaving and maybe having some money from the sale or whatever, and like starting this business, starting that business. And I get to see them all kind of growing up and seeing this sort of engineering ethos that came out of that, and seeing like where does it work, like applying it to all of these different places. But it's fascinating. Thank you so much for having me over in the middle of the night on right after New Year's.
It's turning into a beautiful night, so.
We're really looking forward to having you out in Berlin, so I hope we can have a good time.
Yeah.
And we can keep
It'll
talking about some of this stuff. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
I appreciate
awesome.
it. Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah? All right. Let's see if the roads are still open.